Hello, I'm Hannah, and this is Hannah's Books. Welcome to another installment of this year's Hannah's Bookukkah, where I post for all 8 nights of Hanukkah. Today, I want to make a short video to introduce you to a handful of books I'm really looking forward to reading next month, all with the release dates during the month of January, at least in the US. As many of you know, I sometimes write formal book reviews for publication, and I'm planning to write about at least one of these books. In general, in the U.S. market, books are only released for publication on Tuesdays. I'm going to go through chronologically, but I should give the caveat that release dates sometimes shift slightly. So before you head to your bookshop on the day of publication to pick up something you're really excited about, check with the shop to make sure they'll have copies. That would be a good idea anyway, even if the date remains the same, since some of these titles are not likely to be tremendous sellers, and not all bookstores will necessarily have them in stock. So, let's start with a couple of books that will be released on January the 7th. The first is The Life of Herod the Great, a novel by the great author Zora Neale Hurston, which will be published by Amistad Press. Hurston was a central figure in the Harlem Renaissance in the early part of the 20th century, who wrote widely about Black culture and Black resistance, and was a scholar of anthropology and folklore, as well as a novelist. While she's probably best known for her novel Their Eyes Were Watching God, my personal favorite novel of hers is Moses, Man of the Mountain, a retelling of the book of Exodus from the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament from an African-American perspective. In fact, my husband David and I put together a Passover Haggadah 30 years ago, and we included quotes from Hurston's book. Anyway, coming out in January is a new Hurston, not actually new, of course, but never before published. And similar to Moses, Man of the Mountain, it's a biblical retelling, this time of Herod from the New Testament. In the Bible and in later folklore, Herod is portrayed as a wicked ruler, but Hurston transforms him into what the press blurb calls a forerunner of Christ. As Hurston writes, he, quote, appears to have been singled out and especially endowed to attract the lightning of fate. The book was unfinished upon Hurston's death, but an ending has been constructed by sharing some of her notes and personal letters that show where she was heading. As an academic historian, I find this approach to be utterly fascinating. I might want to talk about that choice and how it works in the book in a future video. The second book on this list is called The Sinners All Bow, 2 authors, 1 murder, and the real Hester Prynne, and was written by Kate Winkler Dawson and will be published by Penguin Putnam. Let me say first that I adore the book The Scarlet Letter, and I'm planning to reread it at some point during 2025. I'm especially interested in what Hawthorne is trying to say politically to his readers. But The Sinners All Bow is focused instead on the real-life story that inspired Hawthorne. Kate Winkler Dawson is a true crime historian who tracks down the story of Sarah Maria Cornell, who was found dead in a New England town in the early 1830s. She had a secret correspondence with a Methodist minister in town. And although writers and investigators have been fascinated by these events, Dawson relies on modern investigative methods, including profiling, and also what she calls forensic knot analysis. I admit that I am not a reader of true crime. I'm not interested in becoming a reader of true crime. But the underlying literary connection, as well as what I hope will be a discussion of women's experience with pregnancy out of wedlock during the period, makes me want to give this one a try. Incidentally, if you haven't yet read Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter, don't assume anything about the plot of the novel based on what happened historically. Knowing about the story of Sarah Maria Cornell really doesn't spoil Hawthorne's novel in any way. And if you're thinking about reading Hawthorne's book for the first time, consider skipping Hawthorne's long introduction, at least until after you finish the rest of the book. Okay, I want to mention 3 books that will be published on January the 14th. The first is coming out from UNC Press, Doc Watson, A Life in Music by Eddie Huffman. You have a special little surprise about this book, which I will clue you in about closer to release date. No hints yet, though. Doc Watson was a folk musician, a guitar player, and a wonderful singer who grew up in the mountains of North Carolina and attended the North Carolina School for the Blind and became one of the folk musicians who really entered the mainstream American music scene in the 1960s. I grew up in North Carolina, and my father taught at a small college in the state. One year, when I was a young girl, Dad was in charge of inviting musicians to come and perform at the school. I got to meet all sorts of people, and sometimes even got to ride in the car when Dad drove to the nearest airport, maybe an hour away, to pick people up, or to go to the pre-party that the department always put on. He invited many amazing folks, including Bernice Johnson Reagan, with whom he had worked during the Civil Rights Movement, and the jazz pianist George Shearing, and Doc Watson. Both of the latter 2 musicians, Shearing and Doc Watson, were blind, and both gave me, as a young girl, their autographs punched out in Braille on little handheld devices. They were by far the most interesting items in my autograph book. At any rate, I'm excited to read this biography of Doc Watson. Another book coming out on January the 14th is The Thinking Heart, Essays on Israel and Palestine by David Grossman. If I'm remembering correctly, it will be published by Vintage International. Grossman is an Israeli, and he's also a long-term peace activist who started writing about the impact of Israel's occupation of Palestinian areas, the impact on Palestinians, but also on the Israeli occupiers decades ago. Even as a very public critic of the Israeli government, Grossman was emotionally sidelined by the October 7th attack. Let me read from the press blurb. He retreated inwards to ask himself anew these difficult and necessary questions about his beloved nation. How could this massacre have happened? How could the Netanyahu government, tangled in its web of scandals, have failed to protect its citizens? And did October 7th and the war that followed take with it the last hope of a 2-state solution? In this essay collection, Grossman tries to understand what it means to live in a Jewish state where, as he sees it, the central Jewish commitment to the dignity of human life is sometimes cast aside. I'm eager to read these essays and hear Grossman's approach, perhaps especially to hear if he's considered paths to peace other than the 2-state solution. I'm sure this will not be an easy read for anyone, but it's important and near the top of my list. Another book coming out on the 14th may also be a little painful for me, and that is Influencing Death, Reframing Dying for Better Living by Penny Hawkins Smith, to be published by Girl Friday Productions. Penny is a hospice nurse who is sort of a phenomenon on social media. Actually, she is one of 2 major hospice nurses that I followed fairly closely in the months when my husband David was trying to decide when was the right time to start home hospice. Influencing Death is her memoir, chronicling some of her life history, but it's also full of stories about what she's experienced as a nurse, supporting people and their families through the dying process. And one of her main goals is to be open and honest about mortality, to help people approach the end of life, their own lives and the lives of their loved ones, with a certain degree of grace. Okay, on to the next Tuesday, January the 23rd. I'm incredibly excited about the nonfiction work, Bright Circle, 5 Remarkable Women in the Age of Transcendentalism, written by the scholar Randall Fuller and published by Oxford University Press. I had the great pleasure to read a galley of his manuscript, that is, an early review copy, and I'll be writing up a piece about the book for publication in Open Letters Review. Transcendentalism, as you may know, was a social movement in New England during the 19th century, fairly heavily influenced by Romanticism. Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau are two of the most well-known figures in the movement. Fuller's book expands how Transcendentalism is often portrayed, and by looking at the particular people he explores in this book, he emphasizes that the way we tend to see the movement is incomplete, and not only because we tend not to include women. I'm not going to say any more than that now, but when my review goes live, right around the time of the book's publication, I think, I'll provide a link to it if you're interested. Well, the last Tuesday in January has a couple of really fascinating titles, both of which I assume will be published on this particular day, so they'll basically be new publications as Black History Month starts. The first is called Written in the Waters, a memoir of history, home, and belonging by Tara Roberts, to be published by National Geographic Press. At the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History, Roberts saw a photograph of the members of Diving with a Purpose, underwater archaeologists who were searching for the wrecks of slave ships that had gone down off the coasts of the Americas and of Africa in an effort to find new details about the lives of people who had been captured in Africa to be transported to slave markets in a variety of countries. Roberts tells the story of these divers and what they learn, and she interweaves that narrative with accounts of her own family history. It's apparently a very personal book. In fact, a scholar friend of mine who's already read a review copy of the book was pretty disappointed that the lesson of the book sometimes seemed to be more about the complications of racial identity in the modern world, especially Roberts' own personal identity, rather than whatever insights the divers might have gained into the experiences of enslaved people and the Atlantic slave trade. As an academic, I'm still hoping that the book highlights some of the research findings, but I can imagine there might be a number of readers equally interested in her personal exploration. The last book I'll mention is From These Roots, My Fight with Harvard to Reclaim My Legacy by Tamara Lanier, to be published by Crown. This is another book that braids together a personal story with an historical account. But instead of focusing mostly on the personal, emotional cost of racism and history, Lanier transforms it into a call all in the name of justice. After hearing family stories about a particular ancestor captured in the Congo and brought to the slave markets of the U.S., Lanier begins to search for whatever documentation she can find. She discovers a daguerreotype of Papa Rinty, as her mother called him, in Harvard University's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology. After years of research into his experiences, partly with the goal of proving that she was in fact his descendant, she mounts a legal case against Harvard. Here's what the press blurb summarizes. The question is, who has claim to these stories, artifacts, and remnants of America's stained history? The institutions who acquired and housed them for generations, or the descendants who have survived? I am very interested in these ideological questions of justice playing out in the historical archives, and I gather Lanier also talks about the complications of using oral history records, including the interviews made by the WPA during the Great Depression, I assume, as well as later sources. If historians only consider written sources, or perhaps only published source material, we're going to get an incredibly limited understanding of the past, given that so many people were illiterate and didn't have access to writing material, much less avenues to publication. Okay, that will do it for this quick discussion of 8 books forthcoming in January. I would really love to hear if any of these books, or other books you know are coming out, sound especially intriguing to you. And if they don't, No worries. There are, of course, many other books coming out in January, many of which will be much more popular and perhaps more universal than these. But this particular set really caught my eye. Thank you so much for joining me today here on Hannah's Books. See you soon, tomorrow, for the fourth night of Bookukkah.